Welcome back to your studies in writing. In this lecture, we want to give an overview of several different key points that will help improve your writing skills. This list is certainly not the only element you'll need to look at to improve your writing. However, I do believe this list includes some of the most important elements that every writer needs to look back on from time to time and examine his or her writing methods. I doubt seriously if any one book could give you all the information that you need to develop your writing skills. So if you want to be a good writer, then I suggest that you gather to yourself numerous books by different authors on how to write and how to improve your writing skills. No one author has all of the answers, nor is any one author capable of teaching you everything that you need to know about writing. Some things each of us take for granted because we're good at certain skills. But the only way to keep yourself from having blind spots as a writer is to get input from numerous sources. So let's look at this list on how to improve your writing. So please take notes, and I hope this will be a valuable source to your writing skills. Any good writing class will have show, don't tell right at the top of the most important things for a writer to improve upon. This is the cardinal rule, or at least one of the 2 or 3 cardinal rules of all writing. Show, don't tell. I'll give you several examples of what that really means. Let's use a broad overview for our first example. The newscaster suddenly appears with breaking news because there has been a catastrophe in some part of the world. She tells us that 20,000 people have been affected by the floodwaters and nearly 10,000 people have lost their homes. Those who've lost their homes have also lost their vehicles, their furniture, and most of them will have no place to stay tonight. No doubt most of us will sympathize with the news, but will not be emotionally involved because we usually aren't moved by facts alone. Knowing only the facts, we're not truly drawn into the story. However, then the cameraman changes perspective and zooms in on one particular person. This lady is standing in knee-deep water. There's debris floating by her. In the background, we can see a house tilted, ready to fall over on its side. The woman in front of the camera is crying, and she's telling the newscaster that I've lost all my personal belongings that I can never replace. I've lost my house. I have no place to sleep tonight. I don't know how my children are going to eat tomorrow. My wedding pictures are gone. All my mementos, all my keepsakes. When we hear that, we become emotionally engaged and we're moved. The first part of the story, we were told what happened. The second part of the story, we were shown. So showing is always better than telling, because telling informs us, but showing engages us. A similar method is used by sportscasters. First, they tell the audience that a specific team lost to its opponent. Next, they zoom in on just a few seconds of the sport and they show us some of the difficulties that the team had in winning the championship. At the outset, the sportscaster just told us about the game, but then they zoomed in and began to show us how it happened. So showing is always better than telling. And as we'll show later in this lecture, there are specific times when you might want to tell as opposed to showing. But for the most part, showing is always better. Let me remind you, the reason showing is better than telling is because in showing we become emotionally engaged. And that's almost always better. Every sermon, every poem, every song is better if the audience is emotionally engaged. Now let's look at the Bible for an example. Acts chapter 2, verse 47 records that the Lord added to the church daily. So this is a summary information that the Bible has given us. Yet in Acts chapter 10, the Bible records an example of how the Lord added to the church daily. And although we're given this information in Acts chapter 2, it's much more interesting in Acts chapter 10 when we read the story about Cornelius and how that the Lord spoke to him to send for Peter, who was at Joppa in the house of Simon, and how the Lord had to speak to Peter and tell him not to call anything unclean that the Lord had called clean. So in the second example, in Acts chapter 10, we're actually shown how the Lord added to the church daily, and that's much more interesting to us. An author might tell us that a character was nervous, but how much more interesting to us if the author shows us that the person is biting their fingernails or pacing the floor or even wiping their sweaty palms on their jeans. Let's look at this writing example. Brittany didn't seem to have motherly instincts. To her, raising children was very trying. Or, Brittany couldn't believe it could be this much work. Couldn't the children leave her alone for 5 minutes while she read the paper? She'd given them crayons and paper, but that wasn't enough for them. They still wanted her. So the first example is a good example of telling. The second example was showing, and showing is usually more interesting. Now let's look at description and how that showing is better than telling. Let's take the first example. Mr. Reed was a fat, ungrateful old man. Versus, Mr. Reed heaved himself out of the chair. As his feet spread under his apple-like frame and his arthritic knees popped and cracked in objection, he pounded the floor with his cane while cursing that dreadful girl who was late again with his coffee. So in the first example, we know that he was an old man, he was ungrateful, and he was fat. We summarized by telling you, but in the second example, we made it much more interesting because we told you about his apple-like frame, how he had to heave himself out of the chair. You heard his arthritic knees pop. You heard him pound the floor with his cane. He cursed the dreadful girl. So the second example for most people would be much more interesting. So, if anyone asks you the cardinal rule for writing, you should be able to tell them that it's showing and not telling. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are times when you will want to tell. You don't need to show everything. If a person gets up and goes to work and then has a difficult day at work, that might be all you need to say. Maybe you don't need to show that they overslept, that the alarm didn't go off, that they spilt their coffee, that they had to fight congested traffic all the way to work. Maybe that's not important. Maybe you could just tell them that they had a difficult day. So everything doesn't need to be shown, but as a good writer, you'll learn what's important. What's important to show and what's important to tell. Usually you'll show what is meaningful. And usually showing does more than one thing. It may not only show something in detail, but it may also represent someone's mood or give an indication of the type of person that they are. So the characteristic of a good writer is that your words will often do double duty, sometimes even triple duty. Now let's look at point number 2. Keep it simple, stupid. All writers should use the KISS method. We should keep it plain, simple, and to the point. That's good writing. Good writing does not necessarily mean that you have to use big words, flourishing thoughts, or eloquence. Good writing is keeping it simple, keeping it plain, and getting the point across to the reader. So whether you're writing a poem, an essay, a sermon, or a song, the best writing is often simple. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. And not only keep it simple, but in keeping it simple, good writing is often to the point, which makes it short. Now I'd like to look at some examples of writing and how we could simplify it. First example, the perimeters of your responsibility are included in the job description you received on your initial day of work at the association. That's a little wordy, but most of us could understand it if we'd take a minute to think about it. But how much simpler to say, your responsibilities are listed in your job description. You received your job description the first day you worked here. It's so much simpler, it's easier to understand, and it's better writing. Here's one from the Los Angeles Times. Much too frequently, the criminal escapes the scene of a crime because he manages to escape the visual capability of the responding officers, said Monterey Park Police Chief John Elder. What was he trying to say? He was trying to say, often criminals escape because police never see them. Here's an example of bad writing that was sent out from an electricity company. In the event of any failure or malfunctioning of any component of the apparatus which renders the appliance inoperative, void, not active, ineffectual, the term operative is commonly used to indicate that some force, such as a statute or contract, is no longer in effect and legally binding upon the persons who were to be or had been affected by it, and necessitates repair before the appliance will work normally. The board will, at the request of the consumer, within a reasonable period and during normal working hours and subject to the conditions and exceptions set out in paragraphs 2 and 3 below, repair or replace such components free of charge. Now, what were they trying to say? One of my students summed it up when they said, it would have been much simpler if they had just said, if we break it, we'll fix it. So keep it simple. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anyone that some of our best examples of writing come from Jesus and the stories and sermons he used. Jesus told his stories using simple words, a simple message, and he got to the point. Because Jesus' greatest sermon can be read in only 8 minutes. His best-known stories are often told in just a few seconds. He summarized prayer in 5 phrases. Jesus rescued a soul with 1 sentence. And he summarized the law in 3 verses. Jesus made his point and went home. So say what you want to say. Don't announce what you're going to say. Say it and keep it simple. Stupid. Point number 3. Avoid slang words and improper grammar. Avoid slang words and improper grammar. I'll be the first to admit that slang words do offer a certain beauty to our language. Slang words characterize us. They help give the audience a signal of our backgrounds, of our origins, of where we're from. But slang words have very little place in writing unless they're used to reveal a character, especially in fiction. Grammar, on the other hand, is a never-ending process. A good writer continues to improve his or her grammar throughout life. There's just so much to learn. But I want to bring just a few important things to your attention here. These are things that, as an English teacher, I've noticed these flaws come up in the classroom over and over again. First, let's look at words that we wrongly use, specifically words that don't exist. Such words as irregardless, brung, busted, clum, drug, growed, snuck, all right when it's spelled wrong, height, and complected. These words all fall into the category of improper word usage. Now keep in mind, you may find some of these words in a dictionary, but they're still improper grammar. A dictionary isn't intended to be a guide for improper word usage. It's a book of definitions. The way it works is after society inserts a word into the language, eventually it becomes part of our everyday dialogue, and eventually it finds its way into the dictionary. So you may find a dictionary that lists the word complected, but the original word is supposed to be complexioned. And as I said, you'll spend years and years constantly growing and learning and building up your vocabulary, building up your grammar skills. Using these words wrongly is a mark of a beginning writer, and you're not a beginning writer. So these are some of the first words that you want to scratch from your writing vocabulary. Now, before I leave this section on slang words and improper grammar, this is a good place to mention about double negatives. What are double negatives? Well, such sentences that say, I can't hardly understand this rule. So there we've used can't and hardly to make a double negative, which some people say makes a positive. I don't think that's really true, but it is improper grammar. John hadn't but 10 seconds to defuse the bomb. It should read, John had but 10 seconds to defuse the bomb. Another example, we haven't scarcely enough time to memorize our lines. So scarcely and haven't are two negatives, and we should eliminate one of them. We don't want no failures in this class. It should read, we want no failures in this class. And of course, all of these sentences, there are other ways to recast them and say the same thing. But look through your work and check and see if you're using double negatives. It's the wise student that will keep a notebook and make a list of common errors, and then when you're finished with your writing, you go back through and look for each one of these errors to see if you've made that mistake. And if you have, take it out, of course. And eventually, by doing that, you'll eventually begin to eliminate these from your writing vocabulary. As a licensed high school English teacher, I don't think that it's necessary that we police our grammar when we're speaking, at least not for the most part. Of course, we don't want to sound like idiots, and we don't necessarily have to sound like lawyers or politicians either. But our personal use of grammar is what makes our language beautiful. However, when we've written something, we're not always there when the audience reads our writing, and we can't defend ourselves or tell them what we mean. So writing is different than speaking in a conversation because, again, in a conversation we have all these gestures we can use, inflections, raise your voice, lower your voice, speed up and slow down, and it's difficult to put that on the printed page. So make a list of common mistakes and keep them in your notebook and go back in your writing and look for mistakes that you've made. Okay, I'd like for you to review and then take a break before you go on to the next video.